Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 6 of today's lecture series on the natural world. In this section, I'm going to be picking up where I left off, talking about Villa A at Aplantis. And one of the things that is most unusual about Villa A is that in addition to having pretty large, extensive excavation of the architecture, we do not have the entire villa. You can see the west wing and the south facade, as well as what happens at the north end of the east wing here, are all beyond the boundary of the excavation edge. But we also have a lot of excavated garden space. So the sort of pioneering garden archaeologist Wilhelmina Jastrzębski worked at Aplantis in the 1960s and 70s, excavating root cavities left in the soil of the garden beds out here. And in more recent excavations, we have also seen a collection of pollen to sort of reconstruct what kinds of plants and also the where these plants were arranged in the landscaping around Aplantis. This is a pretty unusual thing to have, especially in the areas of Pompeii where a lot of excavation took place very early on before the development of these kind of more sophisticated methods for better understanding the space as it was in antiquity. So Aplantis gives us a place where we can actually see how the layout of gardens intersected with some of the architectural and artistic motifs of the villa. And we have fairly good evidence off of which we can reconstruct to some degree the way that there was a relationship between art and the natural world. So if you read through your Bettina Bergman article, one of the things I think that will really stand out to you is the way that the natural world becomes implicated in the creation of elite lines of vision and elite conceptions of decorative space. So Bergman looks pretty closely at these enfilade rooms, the garden rooms of the East Wing, where we have these stacked weirdaria that are decorated quite similarly to one another. And she discusses the way that the small differences in detail of the compositions here allow for a sort of mixing and matching both within the frame of individual rooms and along the elongated view where you can see through windows in each of these Viridaria back into successive versions that are slightly different from one another, showing this fountain, tree, plant life, birds combinations against this yellow background that we see here. So Bergman is very concerned sort of with this elite perspective and drawing out lines of a sort of masterly gaze. And we can see some of these both in our enfilade rooms here. You can see how they all connect to one another with these large entertainment spaces dotted throughout. And on our sort of central axis here leading from the north garden from the road end of the villa towards the south facade looking out at the sea. And here we have this uninterrupted visual line that cuts across the entirety of the villa's core from this atrium room through another one of these interior gardens, another Viridarium 20, and then this large sort of entertainment space, room 21, looking out onto the north garden, showing sort of the roadside facade. So we have here, if any of the sort of elites, the patron of the villa or their guests are in this space, they have this control over a landscape that connects visually the land side and the seaside of the villa. So you have both variety in the kinds of landscapes that you have available to view, and also this sense of being able to bring all these different parts of the world together in one space under sort of one potent power at the center of the household. So the use of these sort of masterly gazes in these rooms of representation of the house kind of brings up a question of how did other people, how did the slaves, how did the workers see this space? Did the sort of natural world play into the representative sphere that was more commonly used by them as opposed to these more elite figures that we so often look at from an art historical perspective with reference to the ancient world? And one place that we can look at the villa to see that is the so-called slave or service peristyle 32, which is kind of at the eastern heart of the house in this central block of the architecture that was original to the first phase of the villa's building in about 50 BC. so much earlier than the East Wing over here, which was built probably around 50 CE. So what we see over here in Courtyard 32 is this peristyle decorated in a really interesting abstract design that shows up pretty frequently in especially fourth style, late period Roman painted houses. And it's conventionally often called zebra stripes. Many scholars think that it is a sort of stylized representation of black and white marble. I tend to think in some cases it may represent the sort of grain of special woods stylized and painted on, so as like a fancy wood paneling that is done abstractly. And the zebra stripe pattern is also sometimes interpreted by scholars as a design specifically for areas of slave populations and service populations, to encourage them to move quickly and to not spend time gazing at the details of the wall, right? So it has a very different graphic quality, of course, than, say, the mythological wall paintings we've looked at with their tiny iconographic details that you might want to spend time moving around the room, looking at the way that different panels interact with one another, thinking through all the literary references that you might be able to brainstorm up that might relate the paintings to one another, right? These zebra stripes have a very different quick graphic impact, and sometimes they also do have this sense of a sort of arrow directional chevron shape going to them that some scholars interpret as a sort of hurry up, quit looking sign. I personally don't really agree with that interpretation, that it is directional or a sign only for service personnel, because so many of the areas that often are designated as slave-specific areas actually seem like they are more display pieces. They are actually prominent within the visual culture of the house, not just for slaves, but also for the elites, able to view them, able to view their work, show off the kind of productivity of the household that is going on. So if we look at the location of Peristyle 32, for example, this slave peristyle, it is very close to a large built lararium of the house here, the household altar. It's very close to this very fancy portico looking out on the seaside. It is a sort of circulation point between the axis on the center with that masterly gaze that we were talking about before, and between the east wing with its set of entertainment areas. So it's not a hidden away space. It's actually quite central. It's avoidable if you don't want it to be on display, but it's also very convenient if someone were to look at this area. Now, Courtyard 32, so is very central out in the villa, and it is also part of the oldest construction of the villa. And the reason that I want to focus on it is because if you look at this little fountain here in the center of the peristyle courtyard, you can see a little cutout at the back. And that cutout is the place where Wilhelmina Jastrzębski discovered a large root cavity of a tree that is now marked here by this sort of log set into the earth. And other finds in the area, including some carbonized chestnuts up on the sort of second story rooms around this courtyard, indicate that this may have been a chestnut tree that actually predated the structure of the villa itself. So that would mean that when the builders began work on this villa, they actually started from a space where they took a living tree that already existed and built it into the center of this courtyard, and then built the villa around that, sort of orthogonally aligned between the seashore here up to the south and this tree here, which is just growing somewhat close to the edge of this sort of bluff above the bay. So we have the villa's builders actually responding to a pre-existing element of the natural landscape and then constructing the villa around it. Of course, at this point in the history, we can see that the builders continued to kind of have a dialogue with this tree over time. When the fountain was later constructed, it was done up against the trunk of the tree at the center of the courtyard. And there's this cutout in the back of the fountain where we can actually see the curve of the trunk itself and the way that the tree was growing up in the center of this courtyard space, constrained by the walls of the courtyard itself. We also see along the walls of this courtyard really beautiful painted plants with painted birds along the interior wall of the garden space. So the paintings themselves, while they are not necessarily of the garden paintings at Livia Primaporta villa style and quality, they're really quite carefully and beautifully rendered, and they have lots of little surprises like birds or insects or tiny critters who are greeting one another in various ways and interacting. So it's a very lively landscape. And if you think about the way that this courtyard would have operated as a visual landscape with a living tree at the center, it really changes the character of the space that you think about. You have to imagine that it would be variably shaded by the leaves in the summertime, and less so in the fall as the leaves are falling off. You may have weather coming in, shifting the light around in the breeze from the sea and making these sort of patterns dance on the walls and maybe even animate these birds and plants that are painted on the inside walls of the courtyard. We know archaeologically that this space was probably a really active part of the productive life of the villa, both in terms of keeping the villa running as an elite space and in terms of its pretenses or actual agricultural productivity. We find farming tools, or archaeologists found farming tools stored here in the center portion of the courtyard as well, showing that this could be a space to actually sort of display the tools of agricultural productivity, in addition to having some really beautiful art, some pretty plebeian style art on the walls as well, all in a really living space populated by actual birds and actual insects, as well as the represented versions on the walls. Just FYI, I have no idea why I turned blue or how to fix it, so I'm really sorry about that. So this next slide here shows a piece that it is an epigram written by the poet Marshall, referring to another example where we see a tree planted inside architectural space, and then it has a long life and grows inside this architectural domestic space. In this case, it is a tree that was transplanted into the atrium of a friend's house by Julius Caesar, which then long outlived the actual man himself and sort of acts as an extension of the agency and life of the person who transplanted it. So seeing connections between people and households and plants and the ongoing lives of growing things as a sort of symbol of an ancestral longevity is a pretty common trope that we actually find in Roman literature, in addition to examples that we see like here at Oplontis, where we see that played out in space. So what I want you to do now, before we come back for our final installment on Villa A and on the natural world in the Roman sphere today, I want you just to respond to the following question in 2 to 3 sentences, and that is, how does the experience of elements of nature in elite domestic space compare with the experience of Romans and the art of the urban streetscape that we discussed last week? So just thinking a little bit about the pervasiveness of the natural world in the way that we see elite spaces establishing their visual culture, with the way that Romans were forced to sort of move through commercial space and public space in order to fulfill the functions of daily life. Can you think of any ways in which we can connect these two spheres together, and think a little bit about how your exposure to the outdoors may be determined in some way by your social status and your class in Roman society? All right, I will see you in the next lecture to wrap these things up, and I hope you are doing well.